everyone should know from this point on that we do record. I will, if you're looking at this through gallery view, you will still be able to see the several screens with names or faces on them. In a moment, I will spotlight Rachel as our author and speaker for the evening, and that way you'll all be able to see her in a a good featured way, and that's what we're here for. So as for those of you who have been here for a few minutes know, Rachel is an old friend of JTS, a student, a member of the community, and someone that we all loved having around for her contributions that challenged us and supported us and everything in between for years. And when I say, Rachel, that we miss you, I'm sure you know that I'm not exaggerating. You are where you are, but when I mentioned to some people that your talk was coming up, they immediately said, "Oh, I want to be there. I remember Rachel so well and love her." So that's a good place to begin. I asked Rachel how I should begin introducing her, what bio I should include. And she refused to be pinned down on that. She said, "Let God determine." So I went to her website and figured that was as close as I could get to God. I don't know what the theology is behind that. But you actually supported it, Rachel, when I did that. So I take it that one way or the other, you're more theological than I am. So I think I must have done something right in that. As I looked through your self-description on your website, I was struck by two things. First of all, how truly intersectional in your many identities you are. Um, but also, I was reminded of the um, Walt Whitman lyric, which has recently been stolen, or as artists say, appropriated, by Bob Dylan in his newest album. Um, I contain multitudes, and your description suggests that is appropriately how you think of yourself. So amongst the descriptions, and this is only some of the list, Rachel asks us to think of her as author, scholar, archivist, rabbi, professor, activist, mother, environmentalist, bridge builder, and there were others there, and there are others that I could add as well. She will be speaking to us tonight on her most recent book, a book that I'm sure many of us can identify with because we know how true it is. It is a book about dangerous religious ideas, or as she described it to me earlier today, about the fact that all religious ideas are potentially dangerous. And religious traditions, therefore, if they are to be ultimately positive in their contribution to ourselves and our societies, require self-critique. They've got to address their inherited traditions with caution. And there's much more to say on that, but that's the book that Rachel wrote, so I'm going to let her say something about it. Let me just share with you a couple of technicalities. There will be time for questions about halfway through Rachel's presentation, and then again at the end. Please send your questions to me in the chat function, and I will collect questions and address them to Rachel at the appropriate time. This way they won't be popping up on her screen, and we won't have to worry about drawing her attention aside to other things or everybody else because you'd like to be listening to her and not paying attention to the chat. So send your questions to me and we will have a chance to address them to Rachel, both, as I said, halfway through and then again at the end. So I'm spotlighting you now, Rachel. You are big on my screen and I hope on other folks' screens, and go right ahead.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks for inviting me to study and talk with folks tonight. And thank you to everyone who's here for making time to think and talk together. And as David mentioned, since it's hard to listen to someone talk on Zoom for very long, I'll break my reflections into two sections. And in the first, I want to lay out the basic thesis of the book, Dangerous Religious Ideas, and dig into one example of this self-critical faith that I assert is foundational to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are the three traditions that I treat in the book. And the second part will address the role of religion in the public square, which is something that keeps coming up in the book because it's an arena where the dangers of religious ideas matter. So as a professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, I do a lot of teaching and speaking in religious communities. And I kept bumping into two assumptions. In more traditional spaces, people often worried aloud that asking critical questions would somehow weaken faith, either that it wasn't allowed or that it was a bad idea. And in more progressive spaces, people often imagined that they'd already reformed their traditions enough so that their religious ideas were never dangerous. And I wanted people to re-examine these assumptions, to see the deep roots of self-critical faith that are designed to improve and deepen, strengthen faith, and to recognize that the work is never done. Because the minute we assume that all the dangers of religion belong to somebody else's faith, we become part of the problem. So I started teaching a course, which is the luxury the professors have to get a whole bunch of smart people in the room to talk about ideas you're still working out in your head. And now I've written a book. The editor asked that I write it as a crossover book, which means that it's both for scholars in the field, but also for the more general public, religious leaders and lay folk who are interested in the way in which religion works in our lives and in our world. And in the book, I argue, as David said, that all religious ideas are dangerous, not only those we consider extremist, but those we embrace, and even those that stand at the heart of faith. And because most religious traditions have always known that, right, always understood that peril, they've transmitted tools of self-critique as an essential dimension of the tradition that's been handed down. The seeds for this work are planted deep in the soil of religious thought, and they're designed for us to cultivate. So I don't argue that religious ideas are more dangerous than other types, because all kinds of ideas fall into this dialectic of danger and possibility, right? But when embedded in religion, there are several critical dynamics that emerge, including, I'll mention a few. One is ultimacy, right? This capacity to override other criteria for justice or goodness, to deny evidence of countervailing ideas, whether it be from long ago, the challenge to the idea that the earth rotates around the sun or that slavery is evil, or now that we're in the midst of a climate crisis. The quality was also evident, this quality of ultimacy, in the Capitol riot. There's a historical echo of holy war in the collation of Trump and Confederate flags, nooses, and Nazi tributes appearing alongside Jesus Saves banners and shofar blowing insurrectionists. Right? The religious dimension helps to justify their inversion of patriotism and grants ultimacy to their worldview. I would argue that that same sense of ultimacy lies behind the unfortunate delay that we've had in acknowledging the rights of women or LGBTQ identified individuals within the religious world. Something that we know to be right was pushed aside for too long and still is in some quarters because religion is claiming some higher ground. Another particular aspect of the danger of religious ideas is that it's woven through every aspect of our psyche and society. So that's not all bad, that's also very good, but it magnifies its power and its presence. So the will to pleasure, the will to power, the will to meaning, all of these psychological drives, religion is bound up with all of them. The building of human community, the custodians of cultural values, an element in our biological and neurological experience and human evolution. So again, it's just so deeply embedded in so much of our lives and our world that its power is magnified. And then the third particular quality of religious ideas that I'll mention in this context tonight is that in the public square, they're often given a pass. That's the way somehow we've interpreted religious freedom, that we can't challenge religious ideas in the public square. And I'll challenge that idea at the end, but that is a way that religious ideas work a little differently than some other dialectically good and bad ideas. So when I talk about the dangers of religious ideas, I of course mean justification for violence, but I also am talking about emotional harm and psychological harm, social harm. For example, talking, say, about God, right? I'm not talking about the folks who murder people for having the wrong God, or at least not talking only about them. Let's consider also the fact that 40% of Americans assert that you have to believe in God in order to be an ethical person. If we don't trust each other based on what we think about the divine, that's dangerous. And to this day, atheists face assaults on their beliefs, find it difficult to get elected to public office in the US. We also have theists in opposing camps on reproductive rights and gun safety and tax policy and a host of other divisive issues who will frequently presume that God's on their side and then heap moral condemnation on their adversaries. And in this way, God sometimes becomes an idol carved in our image, a yes man, if you will, who endorses our policies and our prejudices. But let me hit a little closer to home for this chevra because I don't know that that we do a lot of presuming God's on our side. Maybe we do. But let's take a couple more nuanced examples. My own commitment to pluralism leads me to easily denigrate, or if not denigrate, at least dismiss those who are certain that they have in their hands an exclusive and supreme grasp on God's own truth. But an evangelical Christian colleague said to me, we can't always be the problem that needs to be solved rather than the person with whom you want to build relationship. And I quoted her quite a number of times. Or here's another example, since danger and injustice aren't universally perceived, let's think about gender issues. Traditional communities within many faiths have particular practices related to women that we might consider oppressive. There are limitations on leadership, inequality in legal status, stricter requirements for modesty in clothing, restrictions on reproductive rights, and other religiously endorsed positions that are often experienced as dangerous. Now, we might feel that religious authority is suppressing the freedom of women, and we'll say so. We'll denounce it as a perpetuation of patriarchy. Yet there are, of course, many women inside the traditional communities who affirm the value of these practices and the ideas that underlie them. So in some way, our attitude is also dangerous to them. We can argue that it's internalized oppression, but not without denying their agency to some extent. And in addition, the gender critique often inadvertently adopts tropes that are shaped by the legacy of colonialism, especially when it comes to Islam. So even women who seek to reform aspects of their tradition often perceive that the greater danger lies in society's politicization of their bodies and marginalization of their tradition. So, of course, I acknowledge the great good that religion stimulates as well. In the book, I compare it to fire, something that in its variety of forms is responsible for great blessing. It's something we can't even imagine our world without. But it's also something capable of ferocious destruction, and it's not always the action of a sociopath. It's often accidental, a byproduct, or sometimes justified as necessary for some greater good, some higher purpose. So the power to heal is very much bound up with the power to harm. And so in the book, I consider several examples of this double-edged sword, if you will. I talk about scripture, right? Which can be both a sacred call to advance justice and mercy amidst God's creation, and selectively read authorization to vindicate our worldview or to marginalize those who disagree. It's an eternally relevant text that speaks to us through time and space, but it also has canonized othering and perpetuates attitudes that are grounded in a particular historical context. I talk about chosenness and election, sort of in a matrix that then moves on to salvation and supersession. But chosenness and election can be an aspirational covenant to become worthy of God's blessing, an extension of it in the world, be about faith in God's abiding love and grace, but it can also be a claim of superiority and exclusivity. Reward and punishment can frame a pursuit of justice, discern meaning in suffering, but it also has encouraged retribution and blaming victims for their plight. And you can't, one of the things I argue in the book is you can't really get permanently rid of all the dangers without vitiating the strengths as well. They're bound up one with another. You can continue, and we must continue to do the self-critical work to try to tease them apart, but that work won't ever be done. So to complicate matters further, I think it's important to recognize that some dangers are desirable. You may know that Roman orators and poets hated Shabbat. Right? They thought the Sabbath was a pernicious idea, convinced it would undermine the ethos of productivity that's at the heart of Roman achievement. Rutilius Nematianus called it a plague of ignoble sloth. I love this phrase. And Seneca argued that it makes us waste a seventh of our lives. Well, today we live amidst another culture that tends to value people based on their achievements and productivity rather than their basic humanity. So we may recognize, in fact, there's substantial merit in this dangerous idea of challenging the materialistic standard. And since Shabbat promised rest for servants as well as their masters, the egalitarian commitment probably also had something to do with early Roman suspicions. And in this regard, we would surely celebrate religion's subversive power. So we no longer consider Shabbat a dangerous idea, but the polemicists weren't really wrong in thinking that some of the most important teachings in Tanakh can seriously destabilize society. God's commitment to free a people from slavery. We had to fight a civil war to do that one here, right? Redistribution of wealth every 50 years in the Jubilee to ensure that there won't be a permanent underclass. Dangers come in all shapes and sizes, so some we'd embrace. The capacity within religious thought to imagine a world different than the one we live in, the world transformed or transcended, that's surely a vital source of its power. So these dynamics make it all the more important, I argue, to recognize and activate the self-critical capacities of our traditions. And I'll quickly walk through one example, sticking with scripture. So alongside a commitment to scripture as sacred text that would guide our lives somehow, and long before the rise of historical criticism that would view scripture as the work of human hands, there is embedded in all three traditions a number of tools to guard against the abusive application of scripture. One is awareness of multivocality inside the sacred texts themselves and certainly in their interpretation. We know the way that rabbinic tradition valorizes multivocality. We get to argue about when and how it started, but we know that it's deeply embedded in rabbinic tradition. But it's also there in the Gospels, right? In the New Testament. The New Testament canonized 4 different Gospels, and each one is called the Gospel according to, and they don't all agree on everything. So in telling the central sacred stories, they've got 4 versions as part of their canon, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of other examples, but that's one of my favorites, as is the example about Quran, because there's a hadith, there's a tradition that Muhammad taught that the angel Gabriel first revealed the text to him in one harf, one version. But he argued, Muhammad negotiated to get them all, right? And negotiated up to 7. So he ultimately received 7 ahraf of Quran, 7 versions, ultimately all teaching the same thing, but with enough variant that it could speak differently to each community amongst the evolving ummah, the growing people of Islam. Likely a story that would explain why there, in the early transmission, there were already different versions, but a beautiful affirmation of multivocality in scripture itself. There's also in the 5th surah of Quran what Stephen Frog, when talking about some rabbinic texts, has called a poster child of pluralism. So I'll borrow his phrase here because it is really a poster child for pluralism. In the 5th surah, it says that that Allah affirms the previous scriptures and divine intent in multiplicity, right? I could have made you one people, but didn't. And the reason is that you're supposed to compete with each other in doing good, right? Not in arguing about the truth, but in doing good. There are lots of other examples of the multivocality. You may know, for instance, sort of parallel to the development of Mikraot Gedolot, this wonderful collection of rabbinic commentaries where it looks on the page like scholars, commentators are speaking to each other across time and space. On the page, there's a similar the best-selling Christian Bible book in the Middle Ages was Glossa Ordinaria, which did much the same thing. So in addition to multivocality, we also had a humility that was articulated and transmitted about our capacity to understand. Nicholas of Cusa borrowed a term from Augustine, docta ignorantia, learned ignorance, right? You got to know enough to know what you can't know, a humility of faith. There's also an appreciation for the provisional nature of truth, that what we're actually seeking out through our scriptures are truths to live by. We're looking for a path of faith, not certainty. The rabbinic work on this is fascinating. There are a number of scholars who treat it. Moshe Halbertal and Christine Hayes and Hanina ben Menachem all have some interesting work that I draw from in the book. You have some who argued that it was divinely intended multiplicity, much like what we saw in the Quran verse that I cited. So you could think of Bavli and Tractate Eruvin, where it's taught Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chayim, right? These and these are both the words of the living God. But we also had other views about why there were all these voices. So Nachmanides and his students argued that the sages were authorized to constitute the meaning, even if it wasn't necessarily correct. But the multivocality is in the process of them determining what will be the best path to affirm for the community. And you probably know a very famous Agadah that sort of illuminates this idea, right? Where Rabbi Eliezer is arguing with all of the other sages about whether or not the Avna Achnai is fit. And while it's a very complex story with a lot of things that one can draw from it, ultimately, it does affirm this idea that the sages get to determine the meaning, even if they might be wrong. But then there's a third way of thinking about this provisional nature of truth. Ibn Daud is a good example of this. He said that God's will, it constitutes the single truth of Scripture, right? It's unlike Nachmanides and his students. It's not ours to decide, it's God's to decide. God knows what it means. And we're just trying to figure it out, right? But uncertainty is impossible because of harsh conditions and human error. And the halachic process was this effort to recover what might be God's, what we're hoping is God's intent, but it leaves room for doubt. Right. So these variations of the way we think about the provisional nature of truth are also found in contemporary Jewish scholarship and discussion around how we navigate how to think about our scripture and its understanding. There's also within all three traditions this notion that we cannot avoid the human element in interpretation and application of scripture. So we value the role of doubt in faith. Intisar Rab talks about in Islam, actually, that Islam canonizes doubt. She talks about foundational doubt in that there are a lot of things Quran doesn't even talk about. She talks about substantive, procedural, or interpretive doubt that's fed by textual ambiguity and legal pluralism, all of which is transmitted within Islamic tradition to enshrine doubt as an essential part of faith and of thinking about the meanings of scripture. And the last thing I'd mention that is embedded all through all three traditions, and you can see it throughout history, is there really is a consciousness about historical change and its impact on the meaning of scripture. Sometimes these tools are themselves dangerous. So when Christianity talks about accommodation and thinking, that God speaks to us sort of where we are in any given moment, that principle was also used to sort of explain why the whole Hebrew Bible doesn't really apply anymore in terms of its covenantal instructions. Similarly, in Islam, the principle of naskh, this idea that God speaking and teaching contextually can override a previous teaching with a new one that speaks more appropriately to the current moment, to the new moment. This principle is called naskh. So, within Jewish tradition, there's again a very famous story that you probably know that's my favorite example of consciousness of historical change. And that's the story of Moses in Rabbi Akiva's classroom from the Bavli in Tractate Menachot. Right? Moses shows up in Rabbi Akiva's classroom. He doesn't understand a thing. He's got to sit in the back with all the newbies. And finally, one of the students asks, Rabbi, how do you know this stuff? And Rabbi Akiva says, it's from Moses on Sinai, right? So again, the story goes on, but because Agadot in the Bavli are never simple, they're always rich and thick with all kinds of teachings. But for our purposes, it demonstrates the reality of the fact that it can be an authentic transmission of tradition that is still so unrecognizable to its quote unquote founder that he doesn't even know what's going on. So it's a wonderful example. I fill over, I think, 40 pages of the book unpacking all the historical examples and the ways that the traditions recognized we can't wield scripture like a weapon all the time against each other with some version of certainty about its meaning, some singular certainty. And again, these are not fail-safe tools. Collectively, they do have the power to mitigate some of the dangers of scripture. And I think that the historical models of self-critical faith matter, not only because I'm a nerd who studies the history of exegesis, but because they demonstrate this is not some tool of contemporary secularism that's bent on destroying religion, but these ideas are built into our spiritual inheritance. And they're not the exclusive property of progressives or of a single tradition, and the work is never done. It's really the foundation for deepening faith and the glue for holding together a diverse society. So I'll stop there in terms of talking specifically about those aspects of the book and see if there's any comments or questions that people want to raise here, and then we'll have some time to talk about religion in the public square after that.
So everybody, if you've got questions about what you've heard so far, please send them to me. While you were speaking, Rachel, Mark asked whether there is a danger of granting ultimacy to specific political views in our setting. From the way the question was articulated, I had a sense that he suspects the answer is yes, but he's interested in your opinion.
I think the answer is yes. Foucault once taught that we mistakenly assume that our adversaries are our enemies rather than our partners in the pursuit of truth. Right? If we could grasp onto that idea and to imagine that people, even people who disagree with us, about really important things, we begin to even doubt whether they have a soul, right? If we could begin to imagine that they might be our partners in the pursuit of truth, because we can't come into that shared space with an absolute certainty of political truth either, that we might better find our way together. I do think that political difference has become the new hardest thing to navigate, right? Paul Tillich talked about religion being the matters of one's ultimate concern. And I think that in a lot of ways, in American discourse, that has transferred over to the political realm. Of course, it gets pretty hard these days to tease apart the political and the religious because they've been so bound up one with another. But I do think that it is harder these days for people to talk to people who don't agree about their politics than people who don't agree about their religion.
Okay, and I've got to ask a question that I know that my doubting uncle would ask, and that is, if there are correctives built in, then why has religion actually been so dangerous?
Well, I don't think that we always utilize them, right? I don't think that just because the tools are there, they're always used and they're always used well. I also think that some of the dangers that I would lift up in our contemporary society have completely forgotten that these tools exist and see them as some enemy of secularism. By the way, when I talk about secularism, I don't see it as the enemy of religion. I talk about secularism in the way that Danielle Heuver-Leger does, which is secularism is the space where we all meet and no order of value gets primacy, right? So religion is one of the things that enters the secular space to make its case, as do other things. So it's not the anti-religious, it's the space where no single organizing paradigm gets to claim primacy. But going back to your doubting uncle, right? I think that a lot of the idea of biblical literalism today has much more to do with modern ideas of scientific certainty than it does with the inherited tradition of scripture. So in ways that I think a lot of biblical literalists aren't even aware of. So I think that one of the dangers is that we've forgotten them. But of course, you can point throughout history of all the ways in which religion has been bound up with really bad stuff. And I don't think we'll ever be rid of it. And if I thought that if we could just get rid of religion, then we'd be done with the dangers, I might advocate for that. But I don't think religion is separable from human experience. And B, we would just find some other ultimate paradigm to do our dirty work. And I don't mean to excuse religion by that and saying it's just a tool being used for political, economic, etc. purposes. There is a power inside religion that participates in that, that it has to take responsibility for. But I don't completely disagree with your uncle's analysis. My cousins would say the same thing.
And okay, this is going to be the last question before you go on, and then we'll take others at the end.
I should add one thing to that before the last question.
Go ahead, please.
I should just say that my objective, though, is not to badmouth religion. My objective is to improve the religious project by strengthening our capacities for self-critical faith. So that's what I ultimately have to say to your uncle.
Okay, thank you. I'll convey that to him. Eric, here I'm going to read it exactly because I don't want to confuse what he's saying. Can your book be helpful to those who think that your pluralism is a dangerous religious idea? Or what path to dialogue is there with this category of person? I assume the person who opposes pluralism.
So I wasn't really sure how it might be received in more theologically conservative spaces, people
Mhm.
who have questions about, worry about pluralism as relativism or pluralism as a distraction from what they're certain is the true way. Um, I thought most likely they just wouldn't read it.
Mhm.
It is beginning to get into a couple church groups and places that I didn't necessarily expect it to be, and kind of a TBD, to be determined about how they'll respond to it. But it is designed to affirm certain things that I think are important to people in those communities. And one of them is that you don't have to affirm that it's a human document in order to exercise self-critical faith, right? These cool tools come from before historical textual criticism. Another is that that it tries to recognize that, it isn't putting the burden only on people who wouldn't identify as religious progressives, right? It says this is work that we all have to do, and so doesn't turn any kind of religious perspective into the bad guy. And I think that that's part of what has them interested, but we'll
Great.
see.
Great. Okay, I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure you have enough time for the second part of what you want to present. So why don't you go ahead?
So, so thinking about religion in the public square, I, like probably many of you, was raised in the tradition of John Rawls, believing that we should utilize public reason rather than religious beliefs in arguing a policy position. So for a lot of my life, uh, many progressives forfeited their public religious voice, right? It wasn't for lack of religious conviction, but rather for this liberal commitment to pluralism and Rawlsian public reason. And it gave the erroneous impressions that political liberalism was hostile to religion, that religious voices were being pushed out of public debate, that religious increasingly meant conservative. And so, as a religious and political progressive, I don't want to relinquish the public voice of religion to people who would use it to deny individuals access to public services, or reject climate science, or legislate bias, or limit our responsibilities to support the disadvantaged. But I know as a Jew, right, that the separation of religion and state has served a vital role in preserving American democracy and creating broad space for spirituality in all of its polymorphous beauty to flourish. So I'm grateful for the disestablishment of Protestantism, which is an ongoing process and an uneven one, because I'm concerned that legally privileged voices impinge on the liberty of other people. Ultimately, I've shifted from a Rawlsian perspective, though. I advocate a conversation model in public discourse rather than one of strict separation. And it's a conversation which, and this probably won't surprise you, in which religious ideas are critically engaged. So that has two directions at least. It's self-critical public discussion and an encouragement of civil debate about other people's ideas, because religious ideas matter too much to give them a pass. So we'll talk about the easier one first. One of my favorite examples of self-critical faith these days is a blog post I read a few months ago by Reverend Rob Schenck. I don't know if you recognize that name. He's an evangelical leader who, with his brother, really began the anti-abortion movement. A lot of people don't know this, but the evangelical community supported Roe v. Wade when it was first issued. No religious idea has always been what we think it means, and that includes the evangelical perspective on when life begins. But he wrote this blog post as part of a series about what's gone wrong with evangelical Christianity. And he talks about having lost sight of the welfare of pregnant women and losing sight of the greatest commandments of loving God and loving neighbor, losing sight of all that's required to be pro-life, including life beyond the womb. And he admitted that he got caught up in the culture wars and the rightness of his cause and the glorification of his own reputation, and that he helped to birth a movement that he feels is evidently not pursuing the common good because it resorts to violence, because it's abandoned so many of its other ethical commitments. And he still believes that fetal life should be protected, but not at the expense of women. And he's willing to wrestle with that tension. And he also began to explore what Judaism says about the beginnings of life, because he recognizes it as the faith of Jesus, even if, as we know, a lot of what Judaism says happened after the time of Jesus. And by saying such things in the public square, of course, even though it's self-critical, other people's religious ideas are implicated. Of course, he's saying things about the anti-abortion and anti-reproductive justice movement. But as self-critique, Shank's voice can make the point very effectively. And it also reveals to us an intra-faith diversity that I think is really important, because it challenges the bias that a lot of people in the progressive religious world have about evangelical Christianity, especially white evangelical Christianity these days. Because an important aspect of moving religious discourse in the public square forward is revealing that we still have multivocality within traditions, within communities, and that demonstrates a capacity for nuance and self-critique and the possibility of change. The second part of this conversation model is a little trickier, because a civil debate about other people's religious ideas can easily give voice to religious bias. But silence is dangerous too, so I'd rather try to do it well. Besides, the people who are really eager to demonstrate religious bias are doing it anyway. So let's offer some counter models. So in the book, I do mention two things that I think are useful in this endeavor. One is just an easy mnemonic. Kathleen Kavanagh talks about the difference between condemn and contemn, right? It's one little letter, but we can feel very strongly against, we can believe that somebody's ideas are terrible, right? Dangerous. We want to challenge them, but we can condemn them, but we can do it without contempt for the person who is arguing on the other side. So I think that that's a good distinction. That goes back to one of the questions about ultimacy in our political perspectives too. If we can speak to each other, even if we're certain we're right, but do it without contempt, we are a step forward from most of what transpires today. The other example I bring in the book, or another example I bring in the book, is Diana Eck, who took on the Southern Baptist publication about Hinduism. Diana Eck at Harvard at the Pluralism Project, she's a scholar of Hindu traditions. So first she wrote a letter to them, and then she shared it publicly. She said, as a scholar of Hinduism, I must say that you've seriously misrepresented the Hindu tradition. And I'd be happy to speak with you about where I think your portrayal is misleading. As an American and fellow citizen, however, I'll defend your right to believe and practice Christianity as you do, and to believe the worst about our Hindu neighbors, to believe they're all going to hell, and to say so both privately and publicly. But as a Christian, let me challenge you here, for I believe that your views of our neighbors are not well grounded in the gospel of Christ as I understand it. So this is just a great model. She speaks from her tradition and not for it, recognizing that there are diverse interpretations of the gospel of Christ. She uses her expertise to challenge them, but without demonizing them. She says, hey, come, let's study together, Zil Gomor. And she affirms their freedom explicitly, which is, for many people in the more right-wing religious communities, is very, sort of like this hot button. So to explicitly affirm their freedom. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's dangerous, but you're free to say so, right? I think that that's an important part of that kind of dialogue. So religion shows up all kinds of ways in the public square. And in the book, I talk about a bunch. And one of them really does, one of the important ones is, in terms of an ongoing conflict, is how we do interpret and apply these laws related to religious liberty. What do they mean? So I'll raise one example that's actually a little bit more recent than the book. The book came out on election day, and this case was argued in the Supreme Court the next day. It's Fulton v. Philadelphia. I don't know if you've been following it. The court will probably issue its decision sometime between now and June. Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia wants to keep its city contract for foster care, but it won't certify same-sex couples as foster parents. So the city said we can't honor our contract because that violates our anti-discrimination laws. And so Catholic Social Services, well, through Fulton, they're suing. So, you know, they're entitled to believe that parents should be a heterosexual couple, but I would argue that they need to seek equilibrium between their religious convictions and the public interest in non-discrimination, as well as the fact that a lot of foster children who need loving homes are LGBTQ identified kids who got kicked out when their families found out. The Catholic Social Services claim, I would argue, does not advance religious freedom. What it really is trying to do is enshrine the freedom to discriminate. And we've seen this before around race. Religion was an important justification, right? When people were trying to avoid integrated schools. If Catholic Social Services wins, which I think it will in the Supreme Court, it will authorize the exemption of religious agencies that receive taxpayer funding from laws that are designed to protect minorities and marginalized individuals. This has been the kind of direction that the court's been going recently. It would allow them, in this case, to turn away people who don't abide by the agency's religious values. So protecting freedom of religion should not mean protecting it above all other things, because equality under the law is also right. I think they should lose the case. I will have an op-ed with Reza Aslan and Corey Walker coming out in the LA Times when they issue the decision. It's sort of 3/4 drafted, waiting for the final decision. But I wonder whether, I would rather address this outside the court system, where there's not a single winner or loser, and the goal instead is to live together without doing harm. Bethany Adoption Services, another evangelical, well, a Protestant evangelical organization recently, you may have seen in the news, agreed that they would equally serve LGBTQ identified couples seeking to adopt children. And the conversation around it, while heated at times, was really very interesting. I think a better model than what we're going to see in Fulton v. Philadelphia. The case illuminates a specific instance of a principle that I believe is worth consideration. And it's with this that I'll end and take a couple of questions. I like Robert Audi's notion of theoethical equilibrium, even though it's kind of a mouthful. He says that where religious considerations appropriately bear on matters of public morality or political choice, religious people have a prima facie obligation to seek an equilibrium between those considerations and relevant secular standards of ethics and political responsibility. So the way I read him, this is not a matter of translation a la Rawls. Instead, it's about balancing. It's balancing what their religion teaches with a understanding of the broader, a plural understanding of the broader public good. It requires people to learn how to stand both inside and outside their spiritual life stances, right? To examine their impact. It requires self-critical faith and the reclaiming of the complexities of our traditions and a commitment to the common good of a diverse society. So I'll stop there because time is short and see what your thoughts are about religion in the public square.
Okay, great. Two questions came in. One, I'm going to give them both to you at the same time because one at least may lead to the other. Um, One of the listeners wants to know um, whether there's a concern that pluralism may turn into relativism. And then another listener is curious how your approach would deal with Jews and Jews for Jesus. Dialogue. I mean, the two groups, and
Yeah.
how do Jews deal with Jews for Jesus? How would your approach address that question? So
All
that's
right,
the
give me one
second.
second. I'm looking at my phone, not because I'm bored, but because I just read one of the best single sentences about how pluralism is not relativism. And if I can find it really fast on my Kindle, I will read it for you.
Is this because as you were speaking out loud, your voice dictation took the question and searched the web for you?
No. I'm moderating new publications in the field of interreligious studies in a couple of weeks, and I thought I should read the books before I moderate the discussion.
Mhm.
And one of them is this massive work by Paul Hedges, and that's where I'm looking. If I
Got it.
can
Got it.
multitask, but if I can't find it fast, I won't. I've actually forgotten how to find my highlighted things on Kindle because I haven't done it in so long. So never mind. Um, but his book, Understanding Religion, has a great quote in the first, I'm only on chapter 3, so it's somewhere in the introduction or first 2 chapters. Um, uh, um, so again, thinking historically about the way that traditions made room for multiplicity, sometimes in Islam, for instance, there's this notion of irja, of deferment, right? There is a right answer, but because we're human, we're all going to be grasping at it in different ways, see some different aspect of it, and God will tell us at the end, right?
Mhm.
Um, there are different traditional answers for why pluralism and multiplicity, but celebrating the diversity of religious expression is not the same as relativism. Um, uh, the way
Jews for
I
Jesus.
the way I sometimes talk about it is similar to this notion from Islam: is there is a divine standard, but it's always mediated humanly.
Mhm.
So it's no more relative to acknowledge that we've all got some piece of it, I think, and we've all got some piece of it wrong, I think. But it just means that uh, certainty and absolutism, right? Pluralism is the opposite of absolutism. It is not the same as relativism.
Okay.
I'm not able to say this very articulately. I'm not exactly sure because I'm still reaching for what Paul said because it was just so
Mhm.
brilliant. But I'll try to let go of it. In terms of Jews for Jesus, it's interesting. I've worked for the last decade at what is a historically Protestant seminary, now multi-faith, and I've moved on certain kinds of issues. And one is the way that I want to think about Jews for Jesus. Now, Jews for Jesus is an interesting thing because it used to be, at least in some measure, or some significant proportion, Jews who were, like some of the Jews of antiquity, from within the followers of Jesus, Jews who wanted to kind of keep their Jewish heritage, but acknowledge Jesus as Messiah. And today, Jews for Jesus are much more often people who are raised within Christianity, who have become sort of in love with Hebrew Bible and Jewish tradition, and want to claim Jewish expression and Jewish identity without giving up their Christian beliefs. So Jews for Jesus is an odd name for it now. But the short answer is yes. I don't think you can take anybody out of the conversation if you say we want to have public conversation. I think the real question for Jews, the hard question that your question gets at, is do we feel obligated to acknowledge or affirm their claim to Jewish identity, to include them in the, Am Yisrael kind of sense of peoplehood? And my general default answer to questions about religious identity is, let's start by trying to let people define themselves and meet them where they say they are. But boundaries are not inherently bad, right? They help structures cohere. And so it's fair for Jewish communities to say, this is how I understand Judaism, and this is outside of that. But they need to be in conversation one with another. I think that one of the questions that it raises for us is who owns traditions, right? So let's look at it from a different perspective. There's a group called the Roman Catholic Women Priests. They believe, they're raised as Roman Catholics. They believe women should be ordained. They're not willing to wait for the church to get there. And so they have a practice of ordaining women. Once they're ordained, they're excommunicated. So do we say, the church, right? The hierarchy that exists in the Roman Catholic Church gets to determine who is and isn't a Catholic, and therefore deny the Roman Catholic women priests a seat at the table, sitting as Catholics, right? So I think taking it and putting it into a different kind of perspective helps us see that one of the set of questions we have to address forthrightly is who do we think owns traditions, and what does that mean? Because ultimately that's about power. And when people assert power over traditions, it will always put someone in the center and someone at the margin. So we have to be willing to grapple with that as yet another dangerous religious idea, because one of the great strengths of religion is the building of communities. But the necessary and automatic complement to that is it puts someone outside that community as well.
Okay, this is gonna be the last question. Questions are coming in quickly now. Are you open to people writing to you directly via email after the event? Okay. So somebody wants to know, if we're willing to, and according to your approach, even called to enter pluralistic dialogue with people who hold views that are different than ours, and if we're also obligated to be self-critical about our own faiths, traditions, and how we understand the direction from which they emerge. What's the place of compromise? Are we obligated to compromise? What are the limits of compromise? I know that's a large and complicated question, but maybe you can spend a couple of minutes on it and then let people read the book if you talk about it there.
So I assume you're not asking, do we need to compromise our, inside our religious practice, right? You're asking in the public square, in the context of the conversation we just had, if we're trying to have this,
Well, to be very specific, if you hold liberal religious views, right, and you are in dialogue with others who hold more conservative views, do you recognize that, both, where you quote unquote come from, and have an obligation to acknowledge and respect the position of the other? And does compromise belong there somewhere?
I think respect belongs there. Largely, we can operate in our different religious circles without having to necessarily compromise. But for instance, we did a program where we brought in, I think we called it women in traditional religion, because I work at such a progressive seminary. There was a lot of this kind of, all traditional religion oppresses women. And so we brought women from within those worlds to come and talk about how they see it, right? In order to cultivate a more complex narrative and greater respect in being able to engage traditional communities. That doesn't mean that you have to change your convictions about the equality of women and to work your very best to make sure that in your religious communities, they really do have that equality. But in the public square, we do have to sometimes compromise. And that's where we're talking about the theoethical equilibrium. So, it was a compromise for Bethany Social Services to incorporate and to serve LGBTQ identified people. Some of the evangelical community is furious with them, but they did their own religious internal work to sort of figure out how they could be true to themselves and true to the law. And they came up with their theological equilibrium, a compromise that doesn't wholly forfeit their convictions about family, but recognizes that living where they do and when they do, families come in all shapes and sizes. And in the model of Christ, they want to be able to serve, everyone. So I do think that in the public square, we sometimes do have to compromise. I'd be, I think one of the hardest places for me to imagine that right now, from my own perspective, is, but I have argued it, is around reproductive justice. I sometimes feel that as someone who stands for reproductive justice, that I'm kind of like the left wing, like gun owners on the far right, like any gun legislation of any sort is bad, right? And that tends to be the response of my community and myself to any kind of restrictions around reproductive choice. But I wonder if we could have a healthier society and a better situation for women in all parts of the country if we could come to compromise. So that would require me compromising aspects of my religious and political values. But I think maybe we do have to do that work.
Well, thank you for that very honest answer. And so there are other questions. People will address them to you. On behalf of the Library of JTS, let me thank you, Rachel, for this wonderful talk about your book. I assume that people can pick up the book wherever books are sold.
Wherever books are sold, I encourage folks to go to an independent bookseller kind of group like bookshop.org. Just to, everything we do inscribes or reinscribes power relationships.
Right. Okay, great. And for those of you who are still with us, let me encourage you to come back on Thursday when the library will sponsor an event featuring cantor David Tillman, who will be speaking about the Jewish music of Leonard Bernstein. It stands to be a really wonderful presentation. He put it together in connection to the Museum of American Jewish Experience in Philadelphia on the occasion of Bernstein's 100th birthday, I guess it was. And he's got a lot to share. So go to the JTS website, register, and come back. In the meantime, I wish you all well. And Rachel, thanks for a great evening.
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Have a great
bye-bye.
night.